this next chunk, which is an introduction to Gypsy and Traveller communities with Michael Doherty and Simon Evans. Myth-busting, misinformation and understanding of the cultures and histories of UK Gypsies and Irish Travellers. Could I just ask each of you before we start, could you, for my benefit more than anything, just introduce yourselves and your relationship to what we're doing, and just take it from there. And
I think in order to save time, I would have did that downstairs.
Oh, okay,
so if everybody's happy with hearing
everyone,
about me, but it would just be more of the same, actually.
Fine, yep.
That's okay.
Alright, well, I'm Mike Doherty. I work as a press officer for the Irish travel movement in Britain. I also write news for the Travellers Times. I mainly write about cultural travellers like showmen and bargee, new travellers, that kind of thing, and also about Irish travellers, because at the moment the Travellers Times hasn't got an Irish traveller journalist. Hopefully it will soon. What I'm here mainly to talk about Prejudice and stuff like that and where it comes from. Now, has anyone here had, because I've got a friend he's a serving chief police officer. He was a Gypsy liaison officer for the police, and he's now retired and he works for ASA, which is the Advisory Council for the Education of Romany and Other Travellers. Now, he once said to me, most people have never knowingly spoken to a Gypsy or Traveller. Now, has anyone in here had knowingly spoken to a Gypsy or Traveller? If you put your hands up, I'm interested. Okay, well then maybe he's wrong, because that's at least 40% of you. Most of the rest of you may not have had that conversation, would have got your information, I think, from the media. And that's a lot of the work I do is around media prejudice. Now, did anyone see these billboards when they went up? The bigger, fatter Gypsy of billboards. They're advertising the second series of Big Fat Gypsy Wedding. Does anyone remember them going up around London? Well, around the whole country. They actually, people look at things in different ways. The same image might look different when it's smaller and stuff like that. One section of the population might look at an image in a different way from another section of the population. Some travellers I've spoken to say, what's wrong with that? It's just a picture of a boy. Other travellers I speak to say, it makes us look bad because he looks aggressive. And it gives the idea that all our kids are aggressive and out of control. Now, enough travellers got in touch with us and complained about it that we ran a complaint through the Advertising Standards Authority. Now, first of all, it was thrown out, and a solicitor got involved and started working for nothing for us. And it took a solicitor to actually push the complaint through. And we had co-complainants as well from the Irish traveller community who supported our complaint. And after about 3 or 4 months of argy-bargy, the ASA came out with this poster, endorsed negative stereotypes. Now, to get the full effect, you have to actually see it. You have to actually come out of a tube station and see it right in front of these were going up next to schools and stuff like that. And when you see it like that big, with bigger, fatter Gypsy on it, it gave me a bit of a shock. And I know a lot of traveller children that were bullied in school because of this poster and because of the programme. Now, that programme, Big Fat Gypsy Weddings, I haven't met many travellers who think it's a good thing. Most travellers I have met don't like it. I think the way I look at it is it's not a documentary, it's a reality show. It's like The Only Way is Essex or Made in Chelsea. That's the way I look at it. It's got characters on it. There's no reason why there can't be reality shows with gypsies and travellers in it. you know, it'd be racist to suggest that they shouldn't go on reality shows. But what's wrong is, to me, is that Channel 4 present it as a documentary, and if most people don't know Gypsies or Travellers, and you seem to be like an exception with this audience, where half of you do, then that's where they tend to get their information. And I've noticed that, okay, people will watch The Only Way is Essex and they will laugh, but they won't think that everyone from Essex is probably going to be like that. They'll watch it with a critical eye. That doesn't tend to happen with big fat gypsy weddings. I mean, I've spoken to people who work in the media and stuff like that, and everything else they'll run that critical eye over when they watch the TV, but they don't seem to do it with big fat gypsy weddings. Now this is the ITMB after it won the ASA case. The guy in the middle is the solicitor. We had to put him in because he ain't getting paid, so you know, it's a way of saying thank you. But behind him are the co-complainants for that help push that complaint through. There is an Ofcom complaint going through at the moment, and we don't know how that's going to turn out yet, but that's being investigated at the moment. And our main complaint is, again, not that the programme shouldn't exist, it shouldn't be presented as a documentary, as an insight into a secretive community. And it's that perspective that worries me. I always like to try to turn that on its head. I mean, we get students ringing up and say, oh, I want to do a project on Gypsies and Travellers, but they're really hard to like get to know because, you know, they tend to keep themselves to themselves. Now, with all the prejudice and stuff out there, I kind of like, it's a perspective that worries me. It's like, do they tend to keep themselves to themselves, or does wider society don't want to let them in? You know, I mean, that question needs to be asked. Let's not make that assumption. They're the active ones, they keep themselves to themselves. It's a perspective that worries me. And that perspective is pretty pervasive. Now this is Bridget McCarthy. Some of the work I do is I try and support travellers who are campaigning for this and that and the other. This is Bridget McCarthy. She's a traveller from Haringey, and she is complaining about cuts to her local traveller education service and her local community social work team. I mean, it's one of the things that you hear out there is that travellers don't, and it's always, you know, it's a homogenous group. Travellers are always seen as a homogenous group. They don't do this, they do that. Travellers don't engage with civil society. Well, there you go. And there's another one, again from Haringey, that's Martin McDonough, with a letter to the council as part of this campaign. Now that first one, that actually we managed to get that into the Tottenham and Wood Green Journal as a straight local community campaign about cuts to services. So there is hope there. I mean, the same way as like travellers aren't one homogenous group, the media isn't as well, and there are spaces. Martin McDonough again, and this is Patrick Doherty with the Gypsy liaison officer that was going to be cut. Again, that was taken as part of the campaign to save Haringey services. That was used in the Travellers Times. The one before was used in the Travellers Times. The story was also covered by the Haringey Independent. There's some their kids from the site, and there's another McDonough with his two sons. These are pictures I took from a site in Hertfordshire. There was a young 18-year-old girl, a Doherty, and she was into drawing, and while I was there doing another story, she showed me her drawing. She didn't want to have a picture taken herself, she hadn't done her makeup, but she let me take a picture of her drawings. Now this is the one that interests me. Now she's quite unusual within that family, because she was unmarried and she was 19, and for that particular family that was fairly unusual. But no one was forcing her to get married or anything. And this is the picture that really interests me. Because what that says there, you can't really see it, but it says, where do I fit in? That's a good question. Here's some Scottish Travellers with Sophia, who works for the ITMB. Sophia identifies as an English traveller. She has got Romany relatives as well, though, but she actually identifies as an English traveller. And these 3 women here, four women there, are Scottish Travellers. They've come up to, they're at a launch of a mental health, of a DVD we made about mental health amongst traveller communities called Tell Someone. It's quite a shocking statistic that the suicide rate, what research there is, and most of it comes from Ireland, is that the suicide rate for traveller men is 6 times as high as for the wider male population. And for the Traveller Counselling Service in Ireland, they say that the rate for women is beginning to catch up as well. I think prejudice has got a lot to do with that, and travellers tell me that prejudice, that's why they tend to hide who they are. I've heard traveller men say it just gets inside of you and it's in there, and in my opinion that prejudice is our responsibility. I think I'll leave it there, and I'm going to hand you over to Simon now.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
I'll leave that DVD.
Okay. Yeah, we've heard lots of terms like myths and stereotyping, and why should that occur with a particular group? The reason it occurs, of course, is because one group in society, that is the non-gypsies and travellers, don't know much, or don't think they know much, or don't think they know any gypsies and travellers themselves. And so where there's ignorance, there will be stereotyping, because we all do it, don't we? We all fall back on stereotypes or to describe things. So what I'd like to do is just go through and have a look at some stereotypes. They tend to, when you talk about stereotypes of gypsies and travellers, they fall into two camps pretty well. One's the negative one, and the other one is, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll play a bit of film, just for starters. I will apologise for language in this first piece of film, not from him.
He does swear.
I'm sure. But this is.
It's a campsite. The pike campsite. 10 points. What are we doing here?
We're buying a caravan.
Off a pack of fucking pikes. What's wrong with you? This will get messy.
Not if you're here.
Oh, you bastard. I fucking hate pikeys.
That's a fat car, mister.
Not as flash as your bike, though, is it?
Who are you looking for?
Mr. O'Neill.
Tell me to go and get him.
That's a good lad.
Piss off.
Are you going to go and get him for me?
Yeah.
Well, what are you waiting for?
The 5 quid you're going to pay me?
Oh, fuck off, I'll find him myself.
2.50.
Can have a quid.
Oh, you're a real tight fucker, aren't you?
Now, there is a problem with pikers or gypsies.
What are you doing, partner? Get way back.
Can't really understand much of what is being said.
You tell me. Come about the caravan. Mr. O'Neill. Fuck, man. Tell me, mate.
It's not Irish. It's not English.
How are you? Fair, what is my kindness for the horses, you know?
It's just piking.
Fuck me. You're a little bit sized. How big are you? Hey, kids. How big is he? Big man, that's for sure. Hey, man. I'm looking sorry for this fella. Where's your back to there? Concentrate. You look like a back.
Get out of the way, Mickey. See if the fellas would like to drink.
No, I could murder one.
We know more than done around here, I don't mind telling you.
Get your hands out there, you cheeky little guy. Cup of tea for the big fella. Come on.
Don't be silly, Mickey. Offer the man a proper drink, right?
Oh, you little fucker.
Is the big fella not coming with us?
No, he's minding the car.
What do you think we are? Thieves?
I know nothing like that, Miss O'Neill. He just likes looking after cars. Get dags. Do you like dags? Dags. What?
Yeah, dogs.
Dags. Do you like dags? Oh, dogs. Sure. I like dags. I like caravans more.
You're very welcome.
Now, pikers are well known for their skills in negotiation and business. It's part of the reason they talk like they do. So you can't follow what's being said. But if Tommy can get the caravan for less than the price asked, on his return there'll be an ice cream waiting.
Good dog, good family. Pull on your tight. Get a little homesick for a while, but get over it. See you later, lad. See you, boss. We're all Mickey. Lighters. I see what all the fuss is about. All right, bad fellas. You watch about how you saw it. Look.
Now, I don't know how many negative racial stereotypes you can fit into 2 minutes 40 seconds of film, but every single one of them is there. When they first turn up, old gypsies live in filth and squalor and rubbish. He's doing something down beside his caravan, which it's implying he's doing something down beside his caravan, constantly swearing, constantly spitting, constantly hitting the children around the head. The children are trying to get the wing mirror off the car. They're talking about no murdering done around here, as if there might be murdering done around there sometime. So it's quite well, it's interesting really that for a major box office film that a portrayal of one race of people would be allowed to be so one-sided. But as I say, that is just one stereotype. The other stereotype, of course, is altogether quite different. It's the open road. It's the old-fashioned gypsy with his fiddle round the fire, his battered trilby hat, granny's there gazing into a crystal ball. It's the romance and the freedom. It's quite a different side of the gypsy stereotype.
Oh, you told me, did you call me? Father's gone to prove the cry over the tober in the car, 6 o'clock in the sorrow. Mandy Joe to cross the poop to lullaby the cosh, gan very shaved in, Mandy will get loud. Cush thee, Romy lass, can't you call me Romy lass? So up my dear old Dutchie and the mush goes well. Dal him in the purr mush, dal him in the moy, dal him in the purr and he won't turn no more. Cush thee, Romy lass, can't you call me Romy lass? So up my dear old Dutchie and the mush goes well.
Now I recorded that song a few years ago of a friend of mine in Sussex. And I'll just get this, find my pictures now. Okay. Let's get this here. And it's the language. Now, until the 18th century, like mid-18th century, people were aware that there were these bands of people travelling the countryside, large groups of people, often dark, swarthy people, travelling the countryside, going from town to town, plying their trade and do whatever they were doing. Nobody quite knew where they came from until a linguist in the 18th century heard the language being spoken and recognised it as a form of Hindi. It's actually, Romani is a part of a Sanskrit language. There are still Romani people living in India today. And for some reason, and nobody really quite knows why, but large numbers of people left central, northwest of India about 1,000 years ago, and there are reports of these large groups of people outlandishly dressed with gold coins plaited into their hair, wearing bright clothes, travelling across the continent. And the first written records of these people as they made their way across, Turkey 1,000 years ago, Bulgaria, Hungary, Germany, the first written records of Romani people in the UK was about 500 years ago, 1505. Arriving in the UK. And again, they're described as travelling with horses, with their families, their children, in baskets on horseback, across the land. But of course, when they arrived here, they weren't the only people to be travelling the roads. There's always been people who've travelled to make a living. There's always been nomadic people who make their living on the move. Certainly going back to medieval England and before that, there are people who travel from town to town with their goods, buying and selling, or selling rabbits or food. Checking that you had to have a license to move in those days. You weren't allowed to travel. You were actually owned by the parish. Craftspeople, tinsmiths, potters. This man's obviously a tinsmith. He's got his bellows on his back, being seen on his way by a dog. There were also swindlers, people who travelled the fairs and travelled with their fancy goods from town to town. So when the Romany people, the Gypsy people arrived, they actually had more in common with other nomadic and travelling people than they did with the sedentary population. And we should also, for that reason, keep an ear out to the language. In modern Romany, there's words like jigger for a door, mort for a woman, kenna for a house. These words actually didn't come from India, but they come from the language of the sturdy beggars. They came from Elizabethan cant, the language of the road. So when we start to look at language, we can start to tease out people's history and people's culture, just as you can with English. Our language is made up of many other languages, which actually gives an idea of who we are and where we've come from. So we've got these mobile people. Now, when the first gypsies arrived, they were tent dwellers. I mean, the wagon, the living wagon, the Vardo, was actually only invented in about 1860. It was only in use for about 100 years. Before that, in common with most nomadic people around the world, gypsies were tent dwellers, living in bender tents. And this photograph was taken in about 1910 in the New Forest. And actually, if you look at the tent, the construction of the tent, it's really quite similar to the old sort of Native American teepee. There's a fireplace in here, there's a chimney here with poles holding it up, and there's living accommodation rooms on each side of it. So people would be travelling light with horses and carts. Bearing in mind, these photographs were taken into the 20th century. So we have people, gypsy people, travelling people, still living the same way of life with tents and horses, following work nomadically, speaking the Romany language, right the way up 400, 500 years into the 20th century in the UK. This photograph is taken on Mitcham Common, South London. Mitcham has a large traveller population to this day. And again, you see that the construction of the bender tent is really quite similar. New Forest again. Now, we've also heard earlier on today about Irish travellers. Now, Irish travellers are a very distinct ethnic group to the Romany gypsies, although there's always been interaction. I know families where you have both mixed in, where people have married into each other. But the origins of the Irish travelling culture is equally as old, in fact not older than of the English gypsy and the English travelling culture. They have their own language. It's either called a cant or a shelter. And it seems to be a mixture of very old Irish and ancient English. So there is some idea that actually the Irish travellers are kind of almost a pre-Celtic culture that persists to today. There's also Scots Travelers, again, a separate and distinct group. And we've heard about singers earlier on, like the Robertsons. And these Scots Travelers, again, they're travelling on foot. They've got their tent poles here for their bended tent. He's got his tent on his back. But again, it's a very distinct and separate ethnic group. They travel the highlands, maybe fishing for pearls in highland rivers and streams. At the summertime, they'll be picking fruit, travelling around. So already we can start to see that when we say gypsy or traveller, we've got a big umbrella of people. There's as much ethnic diversity, certainly amongst the traveller population, as there amongst the non-traveller population. You can add into that other mobile groups, like the drovers. Before the days of the railways, it was easier to move meat around on the hoof. People, and these were families of people with no fixed abode, moving around the countryside, driving cattle, driving horses, driving sheep, driving ducks actually as well for that matter. Then later on we get people like the navvies, the navigators, a lot of Irish people, probably Irish travellers as well, working on the large construction sites, digging the canals. And even today, you probably noticed if you drive at the motorway, there's a big motorway construction going on. Caravan site for mobile itinerant workers. Barge people, they call them the water gypsies. A lot of similarities again, of course, with the Romany gypsy in terms of accommodation and decor. You've got small wooden living accommodation, brightly painted, always on the move, the whole family travelling together. And then these photographs were taken in Greenwich in about 1890, South East London. And the more modern equivalent of the tinsmith we saw the man earlier on with the bellows on his back. Certainly many people, I certainly remember the grinding barrow coming around the streets. The bloke would come to grind your shears, sharpen your knives. There's a grindstone here, there's a blow lamp here, and he's cutting circles out of copper or tin to mend pots and pans with an excellent tinsmith. Again, the more sort of the late 18th century equivalent of the fellow we saw earlier on, carrying the rabbits around. Then as you go down where I come from in the Weald of Kent, there were people like charcoal burners, forest workers, always on the move. They were living in bended tents in the forests, travelling from forest to forest, with their whole families, living in the woods, moving on, moving on. Now that's not to say that all these people were Romany people necessarily, but what I am saying is that there would have been a lot of social interaction between all these various travelling and mobile people. If you go to mainland Europe and meet Roma people, you'll find that they're very dark, very Asian faces, because they've tended to maintain themselves, or kept themselves to themselves in some way, less marrying in. But in the UK, of course, there's been a lot of social interaction between travelling people and sedentary people. And don't let's just think that, you know, perhaps they all came here in the 1500s and then stopped coming here. There's no doubt there's been a constant toing and froing of Roma people, Romany people from mainland Europe to the UK. I mean, these pictures, this is Wandsworth Common, taken in 1903, when there was a new influx of people coming across from Eastern Europe on their way to America. This photograph was taken of what's known as Galician gypsies at Epsom Derby Day in 1949. Again, Hungarian gypsies coming from elsewhere, Calderash coppersmiths on the move. So the picture I'm painting is actually quite a complex one, a culturally complex one. But what of the gypsies themselves? This is a photograph taken in Kent about the turn of the 20th century. It's a family of basket makers, because people who are on the move need to make a living on the move. They move in order to make a living. And this is a specially adapted wagon called a brush wagon, which is there to carry you know, all manner of household goods with baskets, chairs, and that kind of thing. Bexley Heath, Broadway, Bexley Heath, 1920s, 1930s, still people going from door to door. A lot of towns and small villages didn't have didn't have shops. Shall I turn this off as well? I think I can probably. It is off. A lot of the goods that people needed were bought by itinerant salespeople. All country towns and villages had annual fair days. And fair days weren't necessarily a time of entertainment as we consider now with mechanical rides. They were actually a time of trade, when the local farmers would bring produce to town. There were goose fairs, there were cattle fairs, there's still horse fairs today across the country. This is Western Green in Kent. And you can see it's fair day on the green. So as well as the local farmers, the local people with local produce, you've also got itinerant tradespeople turning up. But not only tradespeople, because as years went by, of course, these gatherings, these annual fair days, also became times of entertainment. And if you look carefully behind here, there's a roundabout, and there's some swing boats here as well, because people were in town. This is Mitcham Fair, again about 1900, 1910. And when you look at these pictures, what you can see is that you've got the old Romany wagons, the living wagon, the Vardo sitting there, but actually behind it, roundabouts and swings. And this kind of stall there, stalls very much like this today. At horse fairs, you've got Appleby, you've got Stone Fair. This is what you still see. Sevenoaks High Street, 1860s actually. There was a Fairs Act in 1876 which put an end to a lot of fairs, travelling people. It says Richardson's Theatre. So about this kind of time, you had all these travelling people, a lot of Romany people on the move, buying and selling, entertaining. Then we started seeing steam power coming to the fairgrounds, which meant that the steam rides started to predominate. And those travelling people who could see the future of technology bought into this. And it's about then we start to see a new group of travelling people evolve, and that's the circus people, the show people. And you talk to a lot of showmen, they will say, I'm not gypsy, they'll say, I'm a showman. And they like to distance themselves between the gypsy. But in actual fact, what you've got is two cultures which have kind of intertwined back into the 19th century. There's a language of the showground, of the fairs and the circuses, called Polaro. Now, a lot of Italian performers came over, comedian art, the punch Judy people, the puppeteers, Italian actors, because in those days there weren't, again, many theatres in towns. And so Italian got mixed in with the language of the show people. So now they've got their own language. When you've got Polari today, it's actually like a mixture of Romany and Italian and other slang. Of course, the travelling theatre people took that language into the theatre, and you know, camp performers like Kenneth Williams and Jules, the round the horn type thing, very camp, very fit. But you often hear them talking Polari on those old Radio 2 programmes. And of course that language is now passed into the gay community and it's become gay slang. So you kind of got this language of gays saying on the streets, but kind of got bits of Romany come through, bits of Italian come through. This is Epsom Derby Day. You may know that there's a big gypsy fair in the centre of the racetrack at Derby Day. And these are some travelling people with their dancing bear being seen on their way by the gentlemen of the Epsom Constabulary with their bicycles and helmets. So there's another kind of component in here as well, hop picking. Everybody kind of knows, I guess, that the Londoners went down to Kent to pick the hops in September, spent 6 weeks picking the hops. But of course, the gypsies were also there in the hop gardens picking the hops in September. So for 6 weeks of the year, the East Enders and the Gypsies and Travellers were living cheek by jowl. And if you think of Steptoe Son, if you think of the East End kind of stereotypes, and I'm not dealing with stereotypes, but here I go. Steptoe Son, Del Boy, Wonga in his pocket. Wonga, of course, is a Romany word. He has his Chavis is a Romany word. His choring stuff, maybe that's a Romany word. What we see is that there's the rag and bow man, the horse and cart, the Cray twins. All that East End culture is very thick with Romany culture. The barrow boy, the wheeler dealer, the market trader. And those associations come at that time, but maybe more a bit later, because hop picking, say in the southeastern counties, was very important because the reason that most gypsies and travellers travelled was for work. They formed a large pool of agricultural labour, and they were an essential component of the agricultural economy, certainly Kent, Essex, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, going up to the east coast, also parts of Worcestershire, Herefordshire. This is taking their Maidstone on a hop farm, probably the early part of the 20th century. Just starts to give an idea of the size of the travelling population in those days. So what the gypsies would be doing in those days, but in springtime, hops don't go up strings by themselves. You see a hop garden, they actually have to be started, twiddled up the string. So in the springtime, travellers will move onto the farms and start training the hops. Thousands of acres of hops, thousands of travellers. Then right the way through the summer, be going from farm to farm doing the picking work, cherry picking, strawberry picking, peas, beans, maybe staying on one farm for a while before moving on to the next farm. Lavender, South London, Mitcham, all that area was famous for lavender growing and herbs. It's all under Heather Estate now, but again the travellers would move in there. Mrs Sparrowhawk on the streets of London selling her heather. And so life was very much right the way through the summer, picking on the farms. September hops. From September, October time, they'd move on to top fruit and apples and pears. After that, they move on to potato picking up, maybe down around Romney Marsh and back up into Essex. So from springtime, right the way through to late autumn, there was a regular cycle of work for gypsies and travellers to do. Very much an outdoor existence. Whole families would be travelling together. When you see a large group of gypsies, it's because you've got mum, dad, you've got gran, you've got an aunt and uncle, you've got some cousins travelling together. And a very tight-knit family, whereby when mum and dad and all the able-bodied kids are out doing the farm work and doing the picking, grans, the older people will be at the fireside or back at the wagons, doing the domestic duties, looking after the babies, looking after the toddlers. So it's within that context, again, we come back to the idea of a folk song, of an oral culture where knowledge is handed down by word of mouth through the family songs which would take place at that time. Now, this on Belvedere Marshes, the North Kent Marshes were the Thames Marshes were a big stopping place, certainly in the 1920s, 1930s until after the war. And this is the Cooper family. But when you look at the kind of interior of the gypsy wagon, the horse-drawn wagon, what you see, even then, and actually till today in the decor, is Asian influence. We still see the kind of swirls, the flowers, the patterning, which has its roots in Indian culture, in Asian culture. So when not stopping on the farms, places like Yalding, Lees, the common land, people will be stopping on in between times. Now, this all sounds like kind of hunky-dory and very rosy. Very nice, life on the open road, living out kind of from hand to mouth. But it's a different story in the winter time, when actually there was nowhere to go and there was no farm work to do. These photographs were taken in 1933. This picture turned up in the Orpington and Kentish Times of a group of travelling people being asked to leave. But when I researched it and found the rest of the roll of film, taken by the freelance photographer at the time. Of course, it tells a very different story. The police would turn up, and quite often the police would turn up. It didn't matter if mum and dad was there, or the whole family was there. Maybe mum was down calling from house to house with cakes or flowers, or maybe dad was off doing work. When the police turned up, it was time to go. And what they do is bring a gang of men up, like a posse in the Wild West from the local village or the local town, and will just physically evict people, roll them off into the road and push them off. And quite often, didn't necessarily have time, just in the interior, it wouldn't necessarily give people time to pack up inside the wagon. All that cut glass, that china, will just be rattling about and crashing down. And you can actually see the way the woman is kind of looking distraught as this process is going on. And then seen on their way by the police, and actually seen out of the parish boundary, out of that policeman's beat. When he gets to the next copper's beat, he's there waiting for him to move them on again. Now, I was kind of struck, actually, by the body language of those English policemen compared to the body language of these German policemen, taken in the same year with German Roma, German Gypsies, on a Gypsy camp. Because there's always been legislation and laws against travelling in the UK, laws against vagrancy, laws against moving on. And at one time, there's even a death penalty, certainly in the times of Henry VIII, for being a gypsy or for speaking Romany. But back on mainland Europe, actually the situation was far worse. These signs were quite common. This one dates from about 1700, 1715. They were put up outside villages and towns to give a very clear indication of what vagrant people like Gypsy and Travellers could expect if they came into the town. It says here, Straf der Heiden, which is German for punishment for the travelling person. Another one says Straf der Inländer, and here it says Zigeuner. And Zigeuner, of course, is a German word for gypsy. So there's a very clear indications that people should actually keep out of the towns. And of course, that sort of level of persecution sort of came to its logical conclusion in 1939, 1940 with the Nazi regime, when Hitler actually came far closer to his aim of ethnic cleansing with the Gypsies and the Roma people than he did with the Jewish population. Although numerically, of course, far more Jewish people went to the gas chambers, but what they did succeed in doing was wiping out a far higher percentage of the Roma population. You go to places like the Czech Republic today, great swathes of it have been repopulated by Gypsies because they were completely cleansed at the time. So if we just kind of swiftly move on. This is, we're doing about 1,000 years in 30 minutes here today, so it's a bit of a rattle through. But I hope it's going to give you some idea of who we talk about when we say gypsy. When I was growing up in my council house on the sort of North Kent, South London borders, in the 1950s, I could press my nose against the window, and some days I would see this going past. These photographs taken in the 1950s, and 1960s. And these were gypsies and travellers who were coming up from the countryside and going to the winter stopping places. And all the large towns in these areas, like Kent, South London, had winter stopping places where the travellers would go to and stay there, often quite legally, places like Ashtree Lane and Chatham, on the hills up above Chatham. They've been a camp here since the 1890s at least. People either owned their plots or they rented their plots quite legally. This was finally cleared by compulsory purchase in the 1970s. Instead of creating a community, they destroyed the community. Belvedere Marshes, place in the North Thames Marshes, again, where the census returns show that in the 1930s, between 16 and 1,700 people were living on those marshes. Again, to give you an idea of the size of the gypsy population which we're talking about. This is Erith Marshes, Belvedere Marshes. Cork's Pit in St Mary Cray. Again, about 250, 300 families living there, still well into the 1950s. These were large gypsy communities, almost like a village, gypsy villages. But then things started to happen because these people didn't fit in with the kind of the vision of the brave new world of post-war England, where the slums were going to be cleared and where people were going to be rehoused in the homes fit for heroes that never actually materialised after the First World War. What actually happened, of course, was that gradually those large stopping places were closed down. They were redeveloped. But people were basically just pushed off them. But something else was happening in the post-war years. Obviously, with the outbreak of war in 1939, the nation faced starvation because we were importing so much food. So we had the land army, digging for victory, all that kind of thing. Post-war years, determined not to be called out again, the government embarked on a massive industrialisation project of agriculture. What that did, it brought in machinery to pick hops, it brought in machinery to pick peas and to do all the picking work, it brought in herbicides, it brought in pesticides, so all the kind of casual labour that the Gypsies and Travellers used to do in the old days gradually started to disappear. At the same time, it started to bring in a lot of foreign students, and today you go to the farms down in Kent, cherry farms, apple farms, big bunk houses full of Lithuanian students and Chinese students. It's really quite cosmopolitan. But what that did, of course, it meant that suddenly all the work which the Gypsies and Travellers used to do disappeared, started to dry up. With the disappearance of the work went the possibility of staying on farms. So not only the work was going, but a place to stop was disappearing, and the winter stopping places were disappearing. So as we move into the 1960s, 1950s, we start to see life becoming increasingly tough for the travellers. I'll just read this bit out in case you can't read it. Encyclopedia Britannica, 1954. The mental age of an average adult gypsy is thought to be that of a child of 10. Gypsies have never accomplished anything of great significance in writing, painting, musical composition, science or social organisation. Quarrelsome, quick to anger or laughter, they are unthinkingly but not deliberately cruel. Loving bright colours, they are ostentatious and boastful, but lack bravery. So it's Encyclopedia Britannica, 1954. I'll move on swiftly from that. It's nice. But in a way, I suppose, that kind of demonstrates society's attitudes to a race of people, where they have no worth, gypsies have no worth, travellers have no worth. Which meant that as we move into the 1950s and 1960s, we start to see this kind of cat and mouse game between local authorities, police and gypsies and travellers. Travellers trying to find somewhere to stop bits of wasteland, bits of post-war bomb sites, lay-bys, but soon actually being come upon by the council and being forced back out onto the road again. 1962, Dartford Woods, Down Woods, same thing. 250, 300 people living in the woods. One day, the parish council, the church commissioners who owned it, sold it to the parish council so they could evict the gypsies, and just pulled people out, bunged them on the road. And so now we kind of do enter into what I would call, I suppose, the dark days of travel and history. And these are the days of snatch, let's face it. Basically, you have families of people, thousands of people, who have no other way of earning a living. By now, of course, the horse-drawn wagon, the living wagon, the old Romany red wagon, has disappeared. And instead now people they've bought ex-army lorries in the post-war years, and they're putting trailers. This means a number of things. It means you can get further to look for work. You can travel the countryside, you can go further afield. You can do things for the first time like picking up scrap. You can do things like logs, dung carting, tarmacking, all these kind of things with a lorry, which you couldn't do before. So we start to see these pictures in the 1960s and 70s of people living on the roadside in destitution and poverty, scratching a living in the best way they possibly could. And we became quite accustomed to these long lines of trailers, any bit of wasteland, this bit of old bomb site, waiting for redevelopment, people just pull their trailers onto and have to live on them. So the questions start to get asked. Mr. Smith, who's standing there in the middle, why are you living like this? Why don't you just go get a proper job and live in a house? Well, actually, Mr. Smith, he doesn't read or write. He's got no documentation. He's got no birth certificate. Got no national insurance certificate. If he goes to an employee interview, he says, "Oh, okay, Mr. Smith. Illiterate. Where do you live? Oh, second trailer along bottom of Scads Hill, Orpington." Well, actually, no. He's virtually unemployable in a conventional kind of sense. Why move into a house? Well, actually, moving into a house means you have a regular income and everything which that entails. I suppose all the kind of things that house dwellers have always taken for granted. In fact, cutting the grass on Sunday morning and paying the gas bill, the electric bill, all that kind of routine is a foreign land. And actually, it means something else, which I'll come to. I mean, certainly during the 1970s, people were still, 1980s, 1980s, still just having to put in where they possibly could. In 1968, actually recognising something needed to be done, along came the 1968 Caravan Sites Act, which required local authorities to provide accommodation, sites that is, for gypsies and travellers residing in or resorting to their area. But of course, they always undercounted how many gypsies and travellers there were on purpose pretty well. London Borough's only actually provide 12 pitches. So if you take something like London Borough of Bromley, which goes from Crystal Palace right way down to the Kent countryside, thousands of travellers live in that borough today. But to say that's 12 pitches, of course, even up to the current time, that under provision. I don't want to go into the politics and the legislation, that's too much of it, because the story I'm kind of telling, I suppose, is slightly different. But of course, we are now in a period of real antagonism between the sedentary population and the gypsies. So what do we see? Well, we start to see the local authority building sites. A local authority site, Star Lane in St Mary Cray. And I don't know about you, but actually this is not my ideal of a place to live or to park my caravan. What you would get was a slab of concrete with a fence around it, a utility block with a toilet and a place to put a washing machine. You weren't allowed to have fires, you weren't allowed to have horses, you weren't allowed to have dogs, you weren't allowed to carry out a living from your site, from your caravan. It was all against the law. So basically, it destroyed. And local authority sites, council sites, were often left badly managed by local authorities. This boy's living here, but behind him is a vacant plot, right? A plot which somebody could be living on, but of course local authority just kind of leaves it derelict. Now that's sort of a far cry from what we've just been looking at. This photograph was taken in 1962. Right? This is a friend of mine, Ambrose. He's the same age as me. He was 10 in 1962. And when I was in my council house, he was living barefoot around the fire. In the 1960s, in modern Kent, there were still families living like this. A way of life hadn't changed for generations. And also something that hadn't else changed for generations was the relationships within the family, which were so crucial and so important that, at the end of the day, people come together around the fire. That was the time when the old stories were told. That's the time when the songs are sung, when the music is being played. That's the time when the culture is handed down from one generation to another. Because when you split up families, or assume that you're actually going to make everyone into a nuclear family instead of an extended family, that has profound implications on people. And some of the social difficulties that were being alluded to earlier on in terms of mental health, the average life expectancy of a traveller even today is 20 years younger than the sedentary population. Being forced into housing was something that, for many people, was the final insult. You're being forced to live like a Doherty people. You're being forced to live like the people who destroyed your culture. And you're being kind of shoehorned into something. And so everything that used to happen, the way of life that supported people, those intergenerational family ties, the shared money, the shared resources, was all gone. And these are the kind of sites, again, London Borough of Brody built this site. In 1995, this is not a long time ago, but again, it's got 8-foot high concrete all the way around it. It's next to a dual carriageway. There's your utility blocks. Big dual carriageway zooming past. All the carbon monoxide drops down into it. Can't hear yourself speak on this site. It's still being used today, which is an outrage. Another site built in Sittingbourne in Merston. This is the entrance to the site. Crooks of wire there to stop people going from the public road into the private woodland as you go into the site under construction. And then the site is actually surrounded by barbed wire with the crooks pointing inwards. Bear in mind, so this was built less than 20 years ago as a place for people to live on. So, again, you ask yourself questions. And of course, the 1968 Caravan Sites Act, which required local authorities to build these sites, was repealed in 1994 under the Criminal Justice Public Order Act. And this criminal legislation being used for housing. What happened was that the responsibility to build sites was removed from local authorities, which meant less and less sites. And gypsies and travellers in the best kind of conservative traditions of the time were encouraged to provide for themselves. Why should a local authority provide for you? So just as you could buy your own council house, then actually you could build your own site and live on that. But if you try applying for planning permission for a gypsy site, the first thing you're going to get is protests. You're going to get public meetings. You're going to get people going down to the town hall, besieging their local authorities. So we don't want gypsies living next door to us, thank you very much. Even though they've probably been living next to gypsies all their lives without even knowing it. In spite of a farmer, my neighbour's nasty to me, so I'm gonna sell a field next to them and have gypsies on it, just to get my own back, because I won't like that. This is pictures of that site which you saw with the barbed wire around it. This is as it is today, and the kind of, which is actually quite different. The barbed wire's gone, it's been largely pulled down by the people who live on there. But actually it's hellishly overcrowded because there's still a massive under provision of sites for people where people can live their life how they wanted to. But people still jam themselves onto the sites in the best way they can. But if you ask a lot of travellers what they would ideally like, a lot of people would say, well, actually, a bit of land where I can park my caravan, where I can put my trailer, where I can just live with my family, And increasingly, actually, that is beginning to happen. If you ever drive down through Kent, right through Essex, or down through Sussex, you will see these little plots, beautiful little plots, developed with people living how they want to live, their life, their culture, with their families around them. This is Frank Ball's place in North Kent. This is a caravan, by the way. It has to be a caravan. It's got wheels on it to comply with the planning legislation. But basically behind it are trailers. So as his family gets bigger, he has grandsons, then another trailer comes on the site. As they get bigger enough and move away, the trailer goes with them. It's very flexible. It's actually ideal housing solution for a lot of people, not just travelling people, but that would be a good thing to do. So he's got his modern chalet, he's got an old wagon around the back, just like the one he was born in when he was a boy. And that's how he likes to live, why shouldn't he? And if you actually, and all these indications of dirt, just to return to another stereotype, the likes of snatch, the kind of implications of dirt. Actually, what I haven't talked about is actually the kind of things, cultural issues or cultural norms. If you talk about cleanliness in relation to travelling culture, do bear in mind that actually, certainly with English gypsies, you're talking about a culture that has large slants of Asian Indian culture in it still. So things like cleanliness laws, words like mockety, inside the body and outside the body, is something clean or unclean. People might not like having a cup of tea in your house, so they might suspect that you put your tea towel in with your clothes into your washing machine, and that is mockety, don't do it. So there's all kinds of things which are still persistent into modern day culture. You go inside a modern trailer, and again, that kind of decoration which we saw in the horse-drawn wagon is still there. The kind of china that people like to have, the kind of decorations that people have in their houses and in their trailers, is all still there. Simon Heffer writing in the Daily Telegraph, and this echoes 1954. This was last year, bear in mind. I'm amused by the notion that our gypsies are an exotic ethnic minority requiring politically correct care. In my part of East Anglia, they appear to be mainly descendants of English trolls thrown out of the workhouses. Like the non-travelling underclass, they are disposed to squalor, serial criminality, and as a recreation, violence. Now, I always invite people to take the word gypsy out and put like a word like Irish or French or German or even black into those kind of articles, which are still being printed, and see what kind of reaction you get. But of course, for some reason, all this kind of stuff just goes largely unchallenged. Just quickly run through stereotypes. Billy Joe Saunders brought home gold medals from Beijing a couple of years ago, still lives on his family's site. Dr. Brian Belton, a friend of mine in East London, Roman Gypsy with, he's got his PhD, he's a university lecturer. Damien Abbas, who you know, he's got his first from Oxford University, but still went home to his trailer on his site in Sussex during the holidays. David Smith, teacher, still takes his marking home to his caravan on the site in Cambridgeshire. David Morley, poet, runs the literary class for the University of Warwick, marine biologist. His grandmother used to tell fortunes on Blackpool Pleasure Beach. David Smith, lecturer, PhD and works in the sociology department of Cambridge University. Delana Bass, artist. Jimmy Eastwood, striker for Southend. Hester Hedges, she's got a manager in the health service. Jake Bowers, a journalist. And Michael Caine, of course, his parents, his dad was a gypsy. Neil Miller, assistant head of a local grammar school. Shane Ward, of course, Irish Traveller. Patricia Knight, actually, she's a social worker, a professional social worker, now working in gypsy rights. Richard O'Neill is a management consultant, born in a caravan. Ronnie Wood, of course, out the Rolling Stones, half gypsy, half bargeman. And Dean here was in charge of the whole dog breeding programme at Metropolitan Police as a gypsy, because he was good with dogs basically, so he'd been a policeman all his life. So I'm going to leave it there. As I say, it's been a bit of a rattle through, I know, and as I said, there's been a lot of history jammed into it's been a rapid journey through. But what I hope it's kind of giving you some insight. So when we say gypsy or traveller, there's a history here. We're talking about a distinct ethnic minority, and things may not be quite as simple as obvious as you think they are.
Just very quickly, if anyone has any questions.
I should be around anyway if you want to talk to me. Or
Is there
if you want
anyone,
to.
anything anyone would like to ask? Or
I was just wondering, how many people are we talking about? And you've talked mainly about gypsies, but Irish Travellers and Scottish Travellers, and just like to get a kind of ballpark figure of how many population roughly.
The census returns were 67,000. We think that's a serious undercount for various reasons. There are figures out there. We can't find the research for these figures, but there's an EC document which says 300,000, and that includes gypsies and travellers. But I've seen that same figure broken down into 80,000 gypsies, 120,000 Irish travellers, and 100,000 Roma. It's no one knows. But we know there's 67,000 people ticked Irish Traveller Gypsy on the last census form, 2011. First time there was ever a category for gypsies and Irish travellers on that form.
It's much bigger than most people think. Most people don't know how many gypsies. You say people do know gypsies, they say no. But actually, fact, I mean, most people don't know that in the small village I live in, there's 3 traveller families, but they don't say who they are. I know who they are. Most people don't know how many gypsies they walk past on the street every day and give a lot of them to say hello to. So actually, we're talking about a very large. In places like Kent and Essex, my contention is the largest single ethnic minority.
Those traveller site that that you saw, that you showed the picture of in the 90s, that are just you said rebuilt.
Yeah.
There's one going up in Maidstone. Just I had to visit it only this couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
Just exactly the same concrete slab with a little wooden tiny thing.
There are now a couple of developers that are run partly by Romany gypsies, home space sustainable accommodation. They try to buy, obviously don't build sites like that, but the problem is always getting the planning applications passed.
It's virtually impossible as well. I'm in occupational therapy, and the person was a disabled person, but you couldn't get any facilities because they had a very set idea. There's a little block, which is where you do your washing, and the shower block. To get to it, you've got steps, and we couldn't get through to them. That you had to actually wheelchair somebody into it, so they had to manhandle the person up the steps.
Yeah, the plan. What's happening now? I mean, at the moment with Gypsy and Traveller planning applications, there's actually some of these residence groups are now beginning the anti. They say it's just about planning in our area. They are now beginning to join up, and the raid that protested against the camp, the development in Meriden, which was a Romany site, held a national conference where members from all these individual little residence groups all went to. So this is quite worrying. That's the first time that's only started to happen in the last 2 years. This linking up of basically what we think are racist groups.
I had an idea. I'm sure lots of people have thought of it. I don't understand why it wouldn't work. Why can't farmers just let them camp on fallow fields for short periods of time in like a catchment area or something?
Because all his neighbours would be onto him pretty damn quick. I mean, it's just not socially acceptable. And you can't work with outside the planning system. It's the whole point. You can't work out.